Introduction and Ancient Beginnings. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something you probably never thought you'd spend 2 hours hearing about. Candles. Yes, candles. Those waxy cylinders you impulse buy at Target that smell like autumn harvest or beachside memories, or whatever marketing department fever dream someone cooked up. But before candles were about aesthetic vibes and making your studio apartment feel less depressing, they were literally the only thing standing between humans and complete darkness. And let me tell you, the history of how we got from smearing animal fat on a piece of rope to the 3-wick monstrosity sitting on your coffee table right now is, well, it's exactly the kind of meandering, oddly specific journey we're going to take together tonight. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim those lights, ironically with your modern electric switch, grab your favorite blanket, maybe pour yourself some chamomile tea or whatever helps you drift off. Because for the next couple of hours, we're going to slowly, methodically, and with absolutely no sense of urgency whatsoever, explore how humans learned to set things on fire in a controlled manner so they could see stuff at night. Riveting, I know. Let's start at the very beginning, because where else would we start? We're talking about a time so far back that nobody was writing anything down yet, which makes things convenient for historians because we can just sort of guess and nobody can prove us wrong. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been using artificial light sources for somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 years. Now, these weren't candles in any sense we'd recognize. These were more like, I found this hollow rock, let me put some animal fat in it and stick a piece of plant matter in there and set it on fire and hope I don't burn down my cave. Stone lamps, basically. Primitive oil lamps. The earliest examples of these have been found in places like Lascaux in France. You know, the cave with all those famous paintings of bison and horses. Turns out, when you're trying to paint elaborate animal murals deep inside a cave where the sun has never shone, you need some kind of light source. Shocking, I know. These early lamps were literally just shallow stone bowls filled with animal fat, probably from seals or fish, with some kind of fiber, maybe moss, maybe dried plant material, acting as a wick. You'd light the fiber, it would soak up the fat, and boom, you had light. Smoky, smelly, probably gave you some kind of prehistoric respiratory disease light, but light nonetheless. Now let's float forward a few thousand years to ancient Egypt, because of course we have to talk about ancient Egypt. The Egyptians, who seem to have their fingers in every historical pie, were among the first to develop what we might generously call a candle. Around 3000 BCE, they figured out that if you took the pithy core of a reed, soaked it in melted animal fat, and let it harden, you got something portable that could produce light. Revolutionary stuff. These were called rushlights, and they were basically the poverty option of ancient lighting. Quick to make, burned fast, produced mediocre light, but hey, better than sitting in the dark contemplating your mortality. The Egyptians also used something that came a bit closer to what we think of as a candle. They'd take beeswax and form it around a wick. Now, here's where it gets interesting in that mildly interesting historical fact kind of way. Beeswax was expensive, like really expensive. Your average Egyptian farmer wasn't lighting up his mud brick house with beeswax candles. Those were reserved for temples, religious ceremonies, and the extremely wealthy. Because nothing says I'm better than you quite like being able to afford to literally burn luxury goods for light. Meanwhile, over in other parts of the ancient world, people were experimenting with their own versions of portable light. In China, probably around the same period, historians love to be vague about ancient China because the timeline is absolutely bonkers. People were making candles from whale fat, which, if you think about it, required first catching a whale, in ancient times, with ancient technology, just to make a candle. The dedication is almost admirable. They'd also use insect wax and various plant-based waxes, mixing them with seeds and rolled them into tube shapes. The Chinese were also wrapping their candles in paper, because of course they had paper before Europe did, which probably helped with the structural integrity, but also seems like it would be a fire hazard. But who am I to judge ancient Chinese engineering? The Romans, never ones to be left out of any historical innovation, took the candle game and ran with it. Around the 1st century CE, they developed the dipped tallow candle, which became the standard for, well, for an uncomfortably long time. Here's how it worked. You'd take a wick, usually made of flax or cotton if you could afford it, or twisted plant fibers if you couldn't, and you'd repeatedly dip it in melted animal fat, letting it cool slightly between dips so layers would build up. Dip, cool, dip, cool, until you had something candle-shaped. This was tedious, time-consuming, and the resulting candles smelled absolutely terrible when burned because you were literally burning rendered animal fat. But it worked, and more importantly, it was relatively cheap to produce once you had a system going. The Romans used these tallow candles everywhere, in homes, in public spaces, in bathhouses. They also figured out that if you made the wick twisted instead of straight, the candle burned more evenly. Small innovations, but important ones when you're trying to read your Virgil scrolls by candlelight and don't want the flame guttering out every 5 seconds. Now let's talk about tallow for a moment, because it's going to be a recurring character in our story for, 1800 years or so. Tallow is rendered animal fat, usually from cattle or sheep. You'd take the fatty tissues, heat them up until the fat melted and separated from any connective tissue or membrane, strain it, and let it cool into a solid block. This solid block could then be melted again for candle making. It was a byproduct of the meat industry, which meant it was relatively available and cheap. The downside? It smelled absolutely rancid when burned. We're talking about a smell that combined burning meat, acrid smoke, and whatever else was mixed in with the fat. Colonial-era accounts describe the smell of tallow candles as being so offensive that people would only burn them when absolutely necessary. But when your options are smell terrible and see things in the dark, most people chose option A. The other option, as mentioned earlier, was beeswax. Beeswax candles were the luxury item of the medieval and ancient world. They burned cleaner, smelled better, actually pleasant with that subtle honey scent, produced less smoke, and lasted longer than tallow candles. They were also approximately 10 times more expensive, which meant that for most of human history, beeswax candles were the exclusive domain of churches and the very wealthy. The Catholic Church in particular was obsessed with beeswax candles. They were used in every religious ceremony, mandated for certain rituals, and considered more appropriate for sacred spaces than their stinky tallow cousins. There was even theological reasoning behind this preference. Beeswax was produced by bees, and bees were considered pure and virginal creatures in medieval Christian symbolism because people genuinely believed bees reproduced asexually. So using beeswax candles in church was seen as offering something pure and unstained to God. The fact that they also didn't make the cathedral smell like a rendering plant was probably a bonus. Let's drift over to the medieval period now, because this is where candle production really became standardized into something resembling an industry. By the Middle Ages in Europe, candle making had become a legitimate trade. You had chandlers, professional candle makers, who would set up shop in towns and cities. These weren't artisans in the romantic sense. This was often dirty, smelly work that involved large vats of boiling animal fat. The chandlers would buy tallow from butchers, melt it down, clarify it to remove impurities, and then either dip candles by hand or pour the tallow into molds. Mold making was a significant advancement, by the way. Instead of hand-dipping hundreds of candles individually, you could pour tallow into metal or clay molds shaped like candles, let them cool, and pop out multiple candles at once. This was more efficient, produced more uniform candles, and probably saved the chandler's arms from falling off after a day of repetitive dipping motions. The molds were usually made of tin or pewter, and they'd have a hole at the bottom where you'd thread the wick through before pouring in the tallow. Guilds controlled candle production in many European cities. The Worshipful Company of Wax Chandlers in London, for instance, was established in 1484 and regulated who could make and sell candles, what quality standards had to be met, and what prices could be charged. These guilds took their work seriously, probably too seriously, honestly, and there are records of chandlers being fined or expelled from the guild for producing substandard candles, because nothing ruins your medieval reputation quite like making a candle that sputters out after 20 minutes. The quality of candles varied wildly depending on what went into them. Pure tallow candles were the baseline, cheap, smelly, smoky, but chandlers would sometimes mix in other ingredients to improve the burn quality or extend their product. A bit of beeswax mixed into tallow would make a candle burn longer and smell less offensive. Some would add various resins or hardening agents. Others would just add cheaper fillers and hope nobody noticed. Medieval consumer protection wasn't exactly robust. For the average medieval peasant, candles were still something of a luxury. Most rural families relied on rushlights, which were exactly what they sound like, rushes soaked in fat. You'd take the common rush plant, peel away most of the outer skin to expose the pith and then drag it through melted fat, usually whatever cooking grease you had lying around. Once it dried, you'd light it and stick it in a rushlight holder, which was basically a clip on a stand. These rushlights were incredibly cheap to make, which was good because they burned quickly, usually about 15 minutes for a decent-sized rush. So you'd go through multiple rushlights in an evening. They gave off a weak, flickering light and produced a fair amount of smoke, but again, better than nothing. The wealthy, meanwhile, were living their best lives with beeswax candles and elaborate candelabras. Medieval and Renaissance paintings loved to show wealthy interiors lit by multiple candles, which was absolutely a status symbol. Burning multiple candles at once? That's rich person behavior. Having enough candles that you could actually read or do detailed work after sunset? Luxury. The rest of the population was rationing their rushlights and going to bed when it got dark because artificial light was too expensive to burn for leisure. Let's talk about the whaling industry for a moment because this is where things get weirdly interconnected. By the 17th and 18th centuries, whalers had discovered that spermaceti, a waxy substance found in the head cavities of sperm whales, made absolutely excellent candles. Spermaceti candles burned brighter, cleaner, and longer than tallow candles, didn't smell offensive, and were harder and less likely to melt in warm weather. They became the high-end candle of choice for anyone who could afford them but couldn't quite stretch to beeswax prices. The American colonies became major producers of spermaceti candles. The whaling industry out of ports like Nantucket and New Bedford was booming, and while whale oil was the primary product, used for lamps, spermaceti was a valuable byproduct. Companies would process the spermaceti, mix it with a bit of beeswax to help it harden, and produce candles that were genuinely superior to anything else on the market. Of course, this required hunting whales to near extinction, but hey, people wanted nice candles. The spermaceti candle industry was so significant that it became a standard of measurement. The candle power, later standardized as the candela, was originally defined as the light produced by a spermaceti candle of specific dimensions burning at a specific rate. By the 18th century, candle technology hadn't changed all that much from the medieval period. You had your tallow candles for the masses, your beeswax for churches and the wealthy, your spermaceti for the upper middle class, and your rushlights for the desperately poor. Wicks had improved somewhat. Braided cotton wicks were becoming standard because they burned more evenly than twisted fiber wicks, but fundamentally, if you transported a medieval chandler to the 1700s, they'd recognize everything and be able to start work immediately. The real revolution was still coming, but we're not there yet. First, we need to wade through more centuries of people burning animal fat and complaining about the smell. Industrial Revolution and Chemical Innovations. So we've established that for thousands of years, humanity's approach to candles was basically kill an animal, render its fat, burn it on a string. Not exactly elegant, but it worked. Now we're going to fast forward to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, where everything in human civilization was getting disrupted by industrialization, and candles were no exception. The big breakthrough came in 1825 when a French chemist named Michel-Eugène Chevreul, try saying that 5 times fast, or even once, figured out how to separate stearic acid from fatty acids. This discovery was actually part of his broader research into the chemical nature of fats, which he was conducting because someone had to, I suppose. Chevreul found that when you treated tallow with alkali and then added acid, you could extract stearic acid, which was harder and whiter than regular tallow and burned much better. This led to the development of stearin candles, which were a massive improvement over traditional tallow. Stearin was odorless, or at least significantly less offensive than tallow. It burned brighter and more steadily. It was harder, so stearin candles didn't bend or melt as easily in warm conditions. And it could be bleached to a pure white color, which was aesthetically preferable to the yellowish-gray of tallow candles. The only downside was that stearin was more expensive to produce than just using raw tallow, but the quality improvement was significant enough that people were willing to pay the premium. Around the same time, in 1834, another inventor, Joseph Morgan this time, patented a machine for the continuous production of candles. Before this, even with molds, candle making was semi-manual labor. You'd pour or dip in batches, wait for cooling, repeat. Morgan's machine automated the process using a cylinder with movable pistons that would eject finished candles continuously as new wicks were fed into the molds and molten wax was poured. This was a game changer for production capacity. Suddenly, you could produce thousands of uniform candles per day with a relatively small workforce. Mass production had come to the candle industry, and prices began dropping as supply increased. But the really interesting development came in the 1850s with the discovery and refinement of paraffin wax. Paraffin is a petroleum byproduct. Specifically, it's derived from the distillation of crude oil. In 1850, James Young in Scotland figured out how to distill paraffin from coal, and soon after, people realized you could also get it from petroleum. And it turned out that paraffin made absolutely excellent candles. Paraffin candles were cheap to produce, cheaper than stearin, definitely cheaper than spermaceti or beeswax, and competitive with tallow. They burned cleanly with minimal smoke. They were odorless. They could be bleached white or dyed various colors. They were hard enough to maintain their shape in normal conditions. In basically every measurable way except nostalgia, paraffin candles were superior to everything that had come before. The candle industry jumped on paraffin immediately. By the 1860s and 1870s, paraffin candles were becoming the standard in Europe and America. The old tallow chandlers either adapted or went out of business. Beeswax held on as a luxury option, mainly kept alive by the church market and wealthy consumers who preferred natural materials. Spermaceti candles declined rapidly as paraffin captured market share and as whale populations declined from overhunting. Within a generation, the candle that the average person burned had shifted from animal fat to petroleum byproduct, and hardly anyone noticed or cared because the new candles were just better. There were still innovations to come, of course. In the 1820s, before paraffin took over, there had been experiments with braided wicks that would curl as they burned, which caused the tip to poke out into the oxygen-rich part of the flame where it would be consumed completely. This was called a self-trimming wick, and it solved one of the most annoying problems with early candles, the fact that the wick would build up a carbon deposit, the snuff, that would need to be trimmed periodically or the candle would smoke and sputter. With self-trimming wicks, you could just light your candle and ignore it, which was the kind of minor convenience that probably seemed miraculous if you'd spent your whole life using candles that required constant maintenance. By the mid-19th century, wick technology had advanced to the point where manufacturers were using very precisely braided cotton wicks, sometimes with wire cores for rigidity in larger candles, and the self-trimming property was standard. This meant that candles had essentially reached their final form: paraffin or stearin body, cotton wick, cylindrical shape, sold in standardized sizes. The design was so effective that it basically hasn't changed since. But here's the ironic tragedy of this story. Just as candles reached peak candle perfection, they were about to become essentially obsolete for their primary function. In 1879, Edison successfully demonstrated a long-lasting incandescent light bulb. Well, to be more accurate, Edison didn't invent the bulb. Dozens of people had been working on electric lighting for decades, but he developed a commercially practical version with a carbon filament that could burn for hours. And more importantly, he built the infrastructure for electrical generation and distribution that made electric lighting practical for homes and businesses. Electric light was revolutionary in ways that are hard to fully appreciate from our always illuminated modern perspective. It was brighter than candles. It was safer, no open flame, less fire risk. It was more convenient, flip a switch instead of lighting and tending multiple candles. It was ultimately cheaper once you had the electrical infrastructure installed. It didn't produce smoke or consume oxygen. It didn't have the same fire insurance implications. It didn't require constant replacement the way candles did. Within a few decades of electric lighting becoming widely available, candles transitioned from necessity to luxury good, from primary lighting source to backup option and atmospheric decoration. By the early 20th century in urban electrified areas, candles were what you used during power outages, for birthday cakes, maybe for a romantic dinner. They'd become nostalgic, decorative, optional. The candle industry had to pivot hard. Instead of selling candles as a lighting necessity, manufacturers started marketing them as luxury goods, as ambience creators, as scented decorative objects. This is when scented candles really took off as a product category. If people weren't buying candles to see-by, maybe they'd buy them to make their homes smell nice. If candles weren't necessary, maybe they could become desirable for other reasons. This shift actually worked remarkably well. The 20th century candle industry became less about illumination and more about aesthetics and scent. Companies started experimenting with different wax blends, mixing paraffin with small amounts of beeswax or other natural waxes. They developed new dyeing techniques for more vibrant colors. They created elaborate molded shapes. They added fragrances, first simple floral or vanilla scents, later expanding into increasingly specific and bizarre scent profiles. And people bought them, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. The church market remained strong, of course. Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican churches continued using candles as part of their religious practices, and many preferred beeswax for traditional reasons. This kept the beeswax industry alive even as the residential market moved away from it. Beeswax also found a niche market among consumers who wanted natural candles and were willing to pay premium prices for them. During World War II, there was a brief resurgence in candle usage in Europe due to disrupted electrical infrastructure and rationing. People who hadn't regularly used candles for lighting in decades found themselves doing so again out of necessity. But this was temporary. Once the war ended and infrastructure was rebuilt, candles went back to being non-essential purchases. Let's talk about candle manufacturing in the modern era for a moment. Despite all the romanticized imagery of artisan candle makers hand-dipping tapers, the vast majority of candles today are mass-produced in highly automated factories. The process goes something like this. Paraffin wax, often now blended with small amounts of other waxes like soy or palm for marketing reasons, is melted in large heated tanks. Fragrance oils and dyes are added and mixed in. The liquid wax is then poured into molds, could be simple cylinder molds, could be elaborate shaped molds for decorative candles. Pre-cut wicks, usually cotton with a small amount of paper or other stiffener, are positioned in the center of each mold. The wax cools and solidifies, the candles are ejected from the molds, and then they're packaged and shipped. For container candles, the kind that come in glass jars, which became hugely popular starting in the 1990s, the process is even simpler. Wicks are glued to the bottom of containers, the containers are placed on a filling line, liquid wax is poured in, everything cools, lids are applied, labels are added, done. Modern candle factories can produce thousands of candles per hour with minimal human intervention. The rise of soy wax candles in the early 2000s was interesting from a marketing perspective. Soy wax is made from hydrogenated soybean oil, and it was marketed as a natural, renewable, eco-friendly alternative to petroleum-based paraffin. Never mind that the soybean cultivation for commercial wax production has its own environmental implications, or that natural doesn't automatically mean better in any measurable way. Soy wax caught on with a certain demographic of consumers who were willing to pay more for products marketed as environmentally conscious. From a performance standpoint, soy wax burns slightly cooler than paraffin and holds scent differently, but whether it's actually better is subjective and depends on what characteristics you prioritize. Beeswax had its own resurgence among the natural products crowd, with boutique candle makers marketing beeswax candles as the original, traditional, pure option. These cost significantly more than paraffin or even soy candles, but there's a market for everything if you position it correctly. Palm wax, coconut wax, various blends, the 21st century candle market fragmented into dozens of niche segments, each with its own marketing pitch and target consumer. But fundamentally, they're all just different waxes surrounding a cotton wick doing exactly what candles have done for thousands of years, burning to produce light and, increasingly, smell. The scent aspect of modern candles deserves its own discussion because it's become the primary driver of the industry. Walk into any home goods store and you'll find entire aisles dedicated to candles with hundreds of scent options. We're talking about things like autumn leaves, fresh linen, seaside escape, vanilla bean, tobacco and leather, mahogany teakwood, scents that range from the somewhat plausible to the completely abstract. Fragrance companies develop proprietary scent blends for candle manufacturers, and there's a whole science to creating scents that smell good when cold, but also smell good when heated and volatilized by the candle flame. The amount of fragrance oil in a scented candle is typically somewhere between 5% and 10% of the total weight. Too little and you can't smell it when burning, too much and it affects the burn quality and can be overwhelming. The fragrance has to be compatible with the wax. Some scents bind better with soy, others with paraffin. The melting point of the wax matters because it affects how the scent is released. Color is often added to complement the scent because apparently people expect a vanilla candle to be cream-colored and a lavender candle to be purple, even though the color has absolutely no functional purpose. There's also the wick size consideration. Too small a wick and your candle won't melt the wax properly, creating a tunnel down the center and leaving unburned wax on the sides. Too large a wick, your candle will burn too hot, consuming wax too quickly and potentially creating safety issues. Modern candle manufacturers use specific wick sizes correlated to container diameter and wax type, all carefully calculated to ensure optimal burn performance. It's surprisingly technical for what is essentially string on fire in wax. The container candle market is enormous, by the way. These are the candles in glass jars or tins that became standard in the 1990s and 2000s. They're convenient because you don't need a separate candle holder, safer because the flame is contained, and aesthetically flexible because the container can be decorated however the manufacturer wants. They're also more expensive per ounce of wax than pillar candles or tapers, but consumers seem to be willing to pay the premium for the convenience. Three-wick candles became trendy in the 2010s, marketed as having better scent throw and more even burning than single-wick candles. They're just regular container candles with 3 wicks instead of 1, but they retail for 2 or 3 times the price of a single-wick candle, despite not containing proportionately more wax or fragrance. It's genius marketing, honestly. Create artificial product differentiation, slap a premium price on it, and consumers will convince themselves it's worth it because more wicks obviously means more better, right? The candle industry today is worth billions of dollars annually, with the average American household buying multiple candles per year despite having absolutely no practical need for them. Their gifts, their home decor, their aromatherapy accessories, their Instagram props, their self-care purchases. They're anything except what they were for thousands of years, a necessary tool for producing light after dark. There's something almost poignant about that transition. For the vast majority of human history, candles were functional objects, often expensive relative to their utility, that people used because they had no choice. And now they're luxury items that people buy because they enjoy them, even though they're completely unnecessary. The humble candle went from essential technology to nostalgic decoration in less than a century, made obsolete by a superior technology, but refusing to disappear entirely. Let's drift into some of the odder corners of candle history before we move on.
Religious significance, cultural traditions, and strange candle facts. Candles have played roles in religious and cultural practices for as long as they've existed, which makes sense. Humans have always been good at taking practical objects and assigning them symbolic or spiritual significance. Fire itself has been religiously significant in virtually every culture, so a portable, controllable fire source was inevitably going to get wrapped up in ritual and ceremony. We touched on Catholic Church's love affair with beeswax candles earlier, but let's dive deeper into that relationship, because it's genuinely fascinating in a very specific, churchy kind of way. The Catholic Church didn't just prefer beeswax candles. For centuries, they mandated them for certain religious functions. The reasoning, as mentioned, was tied to medieval beliefs about bees and purity, but it was also practical. Beeswax candles produced less smoke, which was important in enclosed spaces where incense was already making the air questionable. The Paschal candle, used during Easter services, was and still is traditionally made from beeswax. This thing is massive, often several feet tall, elaborately decorated with symbols and dates, and it burns throughout the Easter season. The blessing of the Paschal candle during the Easter Vigil is a whole ceremony unto itself, complete with the priest marking the candle with the cross and the current year and inserting grains of incense into it while reciting prayers. It's very theatrical, and the candle itself is meant to represent the light of Christ rising from the darkness of death. Heavy symbolism, expensive candle. Orthodox churches also have elaborate candle traditions, though they're slightly more flexible about what the candles are made from. The candles used before icons and during services are often beeswax, but tallow was historically accepted for parish churches that couldn't afford the premium option. There's a whole theology around candles as offerings. When you light a candle before an icon, you're symbolically offering light, which represents prayer and spiritual illumination. It's a physical manifestation of the otherwise intangible act of prayer. The number of candles used and where they're placed all has meaning in Orthodox tradition. 2 candles on the altar represent Christ's dual nature, divine and human. 7 candles represent the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. The votive candles that worshippers light before icons are usually thin tapers, and the stands that hold them are called candelabras, filled with sand or oil to catch dripping wax. If you've ever been to an Orthodox service, you know the sheer number of candles involved creates this incredibly atmospheric environment. Dim, flickering light, the smell of beeswax and incense, smoke drifting upward. It's very intentionally otherworldly. Judaism has its own candle traditions, most notably the Shabbat candles, lit on Friday evening to welcome Shabbat. Traditionally, 2 candles are lit by the woman of the household, though the number can vary based on family tradition. The lighting of Shabbat candles is one of the most consistently observed Jewish rituals, practiced even by Jews who are otherwise not particularly observant. The candles have to burn for a certain minimum time, and there are specific prayers said while lighting them. They're not decorative, they're functional parts of religious observance. Then there are yahrzeit candles, memorial candles, lit on the anniversary of a loved one's death. These are usually white candles in glass containers designed to burn for 24 to 26 hours. The practice is tied to the Jewish concept of the soul as a divine light, and keeping a candle burning for the full day of remembrance is seen as honoring that concept. Similar memorial candle traditions exist in other cultures. Catholic All Souls Day involves lighting candles for the dead. Day of the Dead celebrations in Mexican culture include candles on ofrendas, and many Asian cultures have traditions of burning candles or incense as offerings to ancestors. The menorah, or more specifically the Hanukkah menorah, Hanukkiah, deserves mention. This is a 9-branched candelabrum used during the 8 nights of Hanukkah, with candles lit progressively each night, 1 the first night, 2 the second, etc., with the 9th candle, the shamash, used to light the others. The tradition commemorates the miracle of oil that supposedly lasted 8 days in the temple, but modern practice uses candles rather than oil lamps in most homes. There are specific rules about the candles. They need to burn for at least 30 minutes after nightfall. They should be placed where they're visible from outside, publicizing the miracle. And the candles can't be used for any practical purpose like reading or eating. They're purely ritual objects. Moving to Hindu traditions, candles and oil lamps, diyas, are used extensively in worship and festivals. Deepawali, the Festival of Lights, involves lighting numerous lamps and candles to symbolize the victory of light over darkness. Every windowsill, every doorway, every surface gets a lamp or candle. The visual effect of an entire neighborhood participating is genuinely beautiful, thousands of small flames creating a warm, flickering glow. The candles are usually simple and unscented because the point is the light itself, not any decorative or aromatic quality. In Buddhist traditions, candles and butter lamps are offerings at temples and shrines. Tibetan Buddhism in particular uses butter lamps, basically candles made from yak butter, as part of daily worship. The butter is mixed with small amounts of tampa, roasted barley flour, to help it burn more steadily, and the lamps are kept burning continuously at major temples. The offering of light is seen as generating merit and symbolizing the wisdom that dispels the darkness of ignorance. It's all very metaphorical and also very practical when you live in a place like Tibet, where yak butter is more readily available than other candle materials. Let's talk about birthday candles for a moment, because this is a tradition so ubiquitous that most people never question it. The practice of putting candles on birthday cakes likely originated in Germany in the 18th century, though the exact origins are murky. German Kinderfest celebrations would include cakes with candles representing the child's age +1 for good luck. The candles were lit in the morning and kept burning all day, or at least they tried to keep them burning, which must have been an exercise in frustration and fire hazard management. The tradition of making a wish while blowing out birthday candles is even recent, probably early 20th century, and seems to be a folk practice that developed organically rather than having any particular origin story. The idea is that the smoke carries your wish up to the heavens, which is a nice bit of magical thinking. The requirement that you blow out all the candles in one breath or your wish won't come true is just added pressure on children, but it does make for dramatic moments at birthday parties. Modern birthday candles are mass-produced, standardized little cylinders of paraffin, usually in bright colors, sometimes with fun variations like relighting candles that restart after being blown out, annoying, or sparkler candles that throw sparks, fire hazard. There are also number-shaped candles, so you don't have to count out individual candles for adults, which is convenient when you're turning 45 and don't want 45 candles crowding your cake. Advent candles in Christian tradition are another timed candle use. The Advent wreath has 4 or 5 candles, traditionally 3 purple, 1 pink, and sometimes a white Christ candle in the center, that are lit progressively over the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. Each candle represents something different depending on which tradition you follow: hope, peace, joy, love, or common themes. It's a countdown to Christmas using candles, basically, and it creates a visual representation of the progression through Advent. Candles show up in cultural traditions around the world in various forms. Filipino Christmas celebrations include parol, star-shaped lanterns that historically held candles but now usually use electric lights because safety. Las Posadas in Mexican tradition includes candlelit processions. Swedish St. Lucia's Day involves a procession led by a girl wearing a crown of candles, which sounds like a significant fire hazard but is apparently traditional. Can you imagine putting lit candles on someone's head? Wild! Speaking of fire hazards, let's talk about candle safety for a moment, because candles cause a non-trivial number of house fires every year. According to fire safety data, there are thousands of home fires started by candles annually in the United States alone, resulting in injuries, deaths, and millions of dollars in property damage. The primary causes are predictable: candles left unattended, candles placed too close to flammable materials like curtains or paper, candles knocked over by pets or children, and people falling asleep with candles burning. The National Fire Protection Association has a whole list of candle safety guidelines that basically boil down to common sense. Don't leave burning candles unattended, keep them away from things that can burn, put them on stable surfaces where they can't be knocked over, keep them away from drafts that might blow nearby items into the flame, trim wicks to 1/4 inch, and extinguish candles before leaving a room or going to sleep. These seem obvious, and yet thousands of people every year learn these lessons the hard way. Tea light candles, those little guys in metal cups, deserve a special safety mention. They seem harmless because they're small, but they burn surprisingly hot, and people often use way too many of them clustered together. Multiple tea lights close together can generate enough heat to crack glass, melt plastic, or ignite nearby materials. There are documented cases of people placing dozens of tea lights on or near flammable surfaces for ambiance and ending up with structure fires. It's the cumulative heat that gets dangerous. Candle regulations vary by country. In the United States, the Consumer Product Safety Commission has guidelines about lead in wicks, which was a problem in the past because lead core wicks help them stay rigid, but burning lead releases toxic fumes. Lead core wicks were banned in 2003, but imported candles sometimes still violate this. The European Union has its own candle safety standards focusing on wick composition, maximum burn time, and labeling requirements. Now let's get into some genuinely weird candle history because we're deep enough into this that we might as well embrace the strange. Human fat candles are a thing that has existed, though not commercially. There are historical accounts of cadavers being rendered for their fat to make candles, usually in the context of body snatching and dissection in the 18th and 19th centuries. Medical students apparently sometimes made candles from the fat of bodies they were dissecting, which is deeply macabre, but also disturbingly practical in an era before electric lighting in anatomy theaters. There's also a persistent urban legend about the Nazis making candles from the bodies of Holocaust victims, which appears to be largely unsubstantiated despite being widely repeated. There were horrific atrocities, absolutely, but the specific candle claim doesn't hold up under historical scrutiny. It seems to have originated from confusion between different testimonies and possibly from deliberate wartime propaganda. Not that the actual documented horrors need embellishment, but the human fat candle story specifically appears to be more myth than verified fact. In the realm of weird but definitely real candles, ear candles, also called ear cones, which are hollow candles that people insert into their ears and light, supposedly to draw out earwax through suction created by the flame. This doesn't work. It has been thoroughly debunked by medical professionals. The wax that people see afterward is residue from the candle itself, not from their ears. Ear candling can actually cause injuries, burns, punctured eardrums, wax blockages from candle drippings, but people still do it because alternative medicine trends are persistent. Trick candles, the kind that relight after being blown out, work through a chemical in the wick, usually magnesium, that remains hot enough after the flame is extinguished to reignite the wick. The ember temperature stays above the ignition point of the wick material, so the wick smolders and then bursts back into flame. It's a fun party trick, and an annoying birthday cake feature, depending on your perspective. Candles have been used in various forms of divination throughout history. Ceromancy is divination by interpreting the way wax melts and forms shapes. Pyromancy is divination by interpreting flames, including candle flames. Different cultures have different interpretive frameworks. A steady flame means one thing, a flickering flame means another. The direction the flame leans supposedly indicates something. How quickly the candle burns down has significance. None of this has any predictive validity, but it's been practiced for centuries because humans love finding patterns and meaning in random events. There's also the practice of using different colored candles for different magical purposes in various folk magic and neo-pagan traditions. Green candles for money, red for love, black for banishing, white for purity, etc. You're supposed to dress the candle with oils, inscribe symbols on it, light it with intention, and let it burn completely. Again, there's no mechanism by which this would actually affect reality, but the psychological effect of ritual can be meaningful to practitioners, regardless of objective efficacy. Let me tell you about the candle clocks that existed in medieval England. These were candles with marked gradations that would burn at a theoretically steady rate, allowing people to track time. King Alfred the Great supposedly used candle clocks extensively. He'd have candles marked to show hours, and he'd burn them to time his activities and devotions. The problem with candle clocks is that burn rate varies depending on air currents, wax quality, wick thickness, and a dozen other factors, so they were never particularly accurate. But before mechanical clocks became widespread, they were better than nothing for nighttime timekeeping.
The auction candle, or candle auction, was a method of holding auctions where a pin was stuck into a candle at a certain height, and the auction would continue until the candle burned down to the pin and it fell out. Whoever had the highest bid when the pin dropped won the auction. This was used in England and colonial America, particularly for property sales. It had the advantage of creating a definite end time that couldn't be disputed or manipulated. The candle decides, and you can't argue with a candle. Though you could theoretically manipulate the candle burning rate with drafts, which probably happened. Candles show up in literature and art constantly as symbols. The mortality symbolism is obvious. A candle's brief flame representing human life, the melting wax as the passage of time, the extinguishing of the flame as death. Still life paintings from the Dutch Golden Age era love including candles, often guttering or recently extinguished as memento mori elements, reminding viewers of life's transience. Poetry uses candle imagery constantly, Shakespearean out brief candle from Macbeth being probably the most famous example.
Candle making as a craft hobby has had a resurgence in recent years, with people buying supplies to make their own candles at home. This involves buying paraffin or soy wax in bulk, fragrance oils, dyes, pre-tabbed wicks, containers or molds, and then melting, mixing, pouring, and cooling. The barrier to entry is low. You can start candle making with maybe $50 in supplies. And there's a cottage industry of people selling handmade candles on Etsy and at craft fairs. The economics are interesting because the material cost for a candle is quite low, but handmade candles retail for premium prices based on the perceived artisanal value. Industrial candle manufacturing, by contrast, operates on completely different economics. Mass producers are buying wax in multi-ton quantities, automating every possible step, optimizing for production speed and cost efficiency. A candle that costs them maybe 50 cents in materials and labor will retail for $10 to $15 because of distribution markup, retail markup, and brand premium. The margins are quite good if you're operating at scale. The environmental impact of modern candles is complicated. Paraffin is a petroleum product, so there's the whole fossil fuel extraction issue. Soy wax requires industrial soybean cultivation, which has deforestation and monoculture implications. Palm wax comes from palm oil, which is notorious for rainforest destruction. Beeswax is probably the most environmentally friendly option, but it's dependent on maintaining bee populations, which have their own challenges. The fragrance oils in scented candles can contain volatile organic compounds that affect air quality. The soot from burning candles, while minimal, contributes to particulate pollution. But realistically, the environmental impact of household candle use is negligible compared to basically any other aspect of modern life. Your car, your diet, your heating system, your consumer electronics, all of these have vastly larger environmental footprints than your candle collection. Still, some people prefer unscented natural wax candles for environmental or health consciousness reasons, and there's a market segment for that. We should talk about candle fragrance chemistry for a moment because it's genuinely interesting. The fragrance oils used in candles are complex mixtures of aromatic compounds, could be dozens of different molecules blended to create a specific scent profile. Some are nature-identical synthetics, meaning they're synthetic molecules that replicate naturally occurring compounds. Others are completely artificial fragrances that don't exist in nature. The molecules need to have the right volatility. They need to evaporate at temperatures produced by a burning candle, but not evaporate from the cold candle. They need to be stable when heated, not breaking down into different smelling compounds. They need to mix well with the wax. Creating a commercially successful candle scent is part chemistry, part market research, part luck. Fragrance companies conduct extensive consumer testing to find scent profiles that appeal to target demographics. There are trends in candle scents just like fashion trends: rustic cabin scents, tropical scents, gourmand scents that smell like food, clean, fresh scents, etc. Companies try to anticipate what consumers will want 6 months or a year down the line, because production lead times mean you can't just respond instantly to trends. The naming of candle scents is its own art form, or science, or marketing exercise. You can't just call a candle Chemical Compound Mixture 47, so companies create evocative names that suggest experiences, or places, or moods. A candle might smell like vanilla and sandalwood, but it gets marketed as cozy fireside, or autumn evening, or something that creates an emotional association. The name matters more than you'd think. The exact same candle will be perceived differently depending on what it's called. Marketing psychology is weird. Limited edition and seasonal candles are a significant part of the modern market. Pumpkin spice everything in fall, pine and cinnamon in winter, floral scents in spring, fresh citrus scents in summer. These create urgency, buy it now or miss out, and they keep customers coming back to see what's new. The actual scent formulations might not be that different year to year, but the packaging and the marketing creates the perception of novelty. Luxury candle brands charge truly absurd prices for what is fundamentally the same product as cheaper options. A candle from a luxury brand might cost $50 to $100 or more, compared to $10 to $20 for a mass market candle. The actual difference in materials cost is minimal. Maybe higher quality fragrance oils, maybe slightly finer packaging, but you're mostly paying for brand positioning.
And people do pay for it because brand positioning works. Having an expensive candle on display is a form of subtle status signaling. The most expensive candles in the world reach genuinely ridiculous price points. There are candles that cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars, marketed as luxury home accessories. Some contain real gold leaf, some come in hand-blown crystal containers, some use rare essential oils. At a certain price point, you're not really buying a candle, you're buying an art object that happens to also be a candle. Whether burning a $1,000 candle is any more enjoyable than burning a $20 candle is left as an exercise for people with too much disposable income. Let's drift back toward the historical for a bit. Colonial America, industrial scale, and the slow decline. So we've covered ancient candles, medieval candles, the various materials used, the religious and cultural significance, and we've touched on the Industrial Revolution's impact. Now let's sink into the specific experience of candle making and candle using in colonial America, because this is where you can really see the transition from craft production to early industrial production playing out. In the American colonies, candle making was primarily a household task, especially in rural areas. Families would make their own candles because buying them was expensive and stores were few and far between. This usually happened in the fall, after butchering season when you had fresh tallow available. The process was exactly as unpleasant as you'd imagine. First, you'd collect all the fatty scraps from butchering, the stuff you couldn't or wouldn't eat. This went into a large pot to be rendered. You'd heat it slowly, letting the fat melt and separate from any meat bits, connective tissue, or membranes. The smell during this process was, by all accounts, absolutely awful. Rendering fat smells like burning meat and death, and you'd be doing this for hours. The melted fat would be strained through cloth to remove impurities, then poured into containers to cool into blocks of tallow. When it came time to actually make candles, you had options. The faster method was dipping. You'd tie wicks to a rod, leaving them hanging down, then repeatedly dip them into a pot of melted tallow. Each dip would add a thin layer, and you'd move to the next rod while the first one cooled slightly. Cycle through several rods, and by the time you came back to the first one, it was ready for another dip. Repeat this process 30 or 40 times, and you'd have candles of usable thickness. This was tedious, time-consuming work, usually done by women and children, and it could take a full day or more to make enough candles for several months of use. The alternative was to pour candles using molds. Candle molds were metal, usually pewter or tin, tubes with a wick threaded through the center. You'd secure multiple molds together, pour melted tallow into them, wait for it to cool and solidify, then extract the finished candles. This was faster than dipping but required owning molds, which not everyone did. Molds were somewhat expensive and considered a worthwhile investment if you were making large quantities of candles regularly. Bayberry candles were a colonial American specialty. Bayberries grow wild along the Atlantic coast, and their waxy coating could be extracted by boiling the berries in water. The wax would float to the surface where it could be skimmed off. Bayberry wax made excellent candles that burned cleanly and smelled pleasant, a slight spicy herbal scent. The problem was that it took an enormous quantity of berries to make even a small amount of wax. Estimates suggest you needed about 15 pounds of bayberries to make 1 pound of wax. So bayberry candles were special occasion items, not everyday lighting. There's a folk saying, "A bayberry candle burned to the socket brings food to the larder and gold to the pocket." This referred to the tradition of burning bayberry candles on Christmas or New Year's for good luck. It was aspirational, basically. If you could afford to burn your bayberry candles all the way down, you were doing well enough that you could expect continued prosperity. If you had to carefully husband your bayberry candles and blow them out halfway, well, times were tough. Professional chandlers existed in colonial towns and cities. These were businessmen who would buy tallow in bulk from butchers, render it if necessary, and produce candles for sale. They'd typically operate out of a workshop with large rendering vats and numerous candle molds or dipping racks. The work was hot, smelly, and repetitive, but there was money in it because everyone needed candles. Some chandlers specialized in high-end products. They might import beeswax and make beeswax candles for wealthy customers and churches. After the whaling industry got established, they might work with spermaceti.
The best chandlers would develop reputations for producing candles that burned evenly and lasted longer, and they could charge premium prices. The town of Nantucket became essentially synonymous with spermaceti candles in the 18th century. The Candle House, a major manufacturer, was processing spermaceti from local whaling operations and producing candles that were exported throughout the colonies and to Europe. These were quality products. Spermaceti candles were hard, white, odorless, and burned significantly better than tallow. They were expensive, but if you could afford them, they were clearly superior. Benjamin Franklin, because of course Benjamin Franklin shows up in every discussion of colonial American history, wrote about candles. He documented his experiments with different wicking materials and different wax and tallow blends. He noted that certain plant fibers worked better than others for wicks. He observed that the thickness of the wick needed to match the diameter of the candle. He was characteristically thorough and pragmatic in his approach. Candles were a technology that could be improved, so why not improve them? The economics of candles in colonial households is interesting to consider. A typical family might need something like 500 candles per year, depending on their patterns of evening activity and how frugal they were with light. At commercial prices, that could represent a significant expense, maybe equivalent to several weeks of wages for a laborer. This is why most families made their own candles even though it was unpleasant work. The alternative was spending money they didn't have or simply going to bed when it got dark, which is what many people did.
The wealthy, of course, burned candles freely. Multiple candelabras in rooms, chandeliers with dozens of candles, sconces on walls. Wealthy colonial homes could be surprisingly well lit after dark. This was conspicuous consumption at its finest. Burning through several candles in an evening just for reading or entertainment demonstrated that you had money to literally burn. Candle theft was apparently a thing. There are colonial court records of people being prosecuted for stealing candles, which tells you they had enough value to be worth stealing. Servants sometimes stole candles from their employers. Warehouse thefts included candles among other goods. This seems quaint from a modern perspective. Imagine being so desperate that you steal candles. But in an era where artificial light was expensive, it makes sense. Let's jump forward to the mid-1800s, because this is when things really started changing fast. We've already covered the chemical innovations, stearin, paraffin, improved wicks, but the scale of production was changing too. Candle manufacturing was industrializing, with factories replacing small workshops. Procter & Gamble, now known as a massive consumer goods conglomerate, started as a candle-making business in Cincinnati in 1837. William Procter was a candle maker, James Gamble was a soap maker, and they went into business together because both industries dealt with similar raw materials, animal fats. They built a factory, standardized their production processes, and grew into one of the major candle suppliers in the Midwest. The Civil War was actually good for Procter & Gamble's candle business. They secured Union Army contracts to supply candles to troops. Soldiers needed portable light sources, and candles were ideal for camp use. The company scaled up production dramatically to meet military demand, and by the war's end, they had established themselves as a major manufacturer. Though, ironically, within a few decades, their candle business would be dwindling as electric light took over, and the company had to pivot hard into other product lines like soap and cleaning products. Candle factories in the industrial era were serious operations. We're talking about multi-story buildings with dedicated spaces for tallow rendering, wax refining, wick preparation, molding, finishing, and packaging. Steam-powered drove machinery that automated parts of the process. Workers, often women and children because this was the 19th century and labor practices were terrible, would tend the molding machines, trim wicks, inspect finished candles for defects, and package them for shipping. The division of labor in these factories was thorough. One group of workers would handle the wax preparation, melting, refining, bleaching, mixing in stearin or other additives. Another group would prepare wicks, cutting them to length, treating them with chemical solutions to improve burn quality, attaching tabs for container candles. Another group would operate the molding machines, positioning molds, pouring wax, timing the cooling, extracting finished candles. Others would do finishing work, trimming the bases flat, checking for imperfections, applying any decorative elements, and then there was packaging and shipping.
Quality control was a concern because a bad batch of candles could damage a manufacturer's reputation. Inspectors would burn test samples from each production run to verify that they burned evenly without excessive smoking or sputtering. They'd measure dimensions to ensure uniformity. They'd check that the wax was properly colored and didn't have visible impurities. Candles that didn't meet standards would be remelted and reprocessed. Worker conditions in candle factories were, by modern standards, pretty grim. The heat from rendering vats and melting wax made the buildings hot and uncomfortable, especially in summer. The smell was unpleasant. The work was repetitive and boring. Hours were long. 10 to 12-hour days were standard. Pay was minimal. Industrial accidents happened, burns from hot wax, injuries from machinery, but this was typical for industrial work in the 19th century. Candle factories weren't notably worse than textile mills or meat-packing plants or any other industrial workplace of the era. The global candle trade was significant. Major manufacturing centers in Europe, particularly in London, Paris, and Hamburg, produced candles for export. American manufacturers exported to Latin America and the Caribbean. There was even trade in raw materials. Spermaceti and beeswax were shipped internationally to wherever they could fetch the best prices. By the 1870s and 1880s, paraffin had largely taken over the market. It was cheaper than tallow, performed better, and didn't have the same stigma attached to it. Petroleum refining was ramping up globally as kerosene became a major lamp fuel, and paraffin was a natural byproduct. The economics shifted decisively in paraffin's favor. But even as paraffin candles were reaching their peak market penetration, the writing was on the wall. Kerosene lamps, which had become common in the mid-1800s, were already replacing candles for many lighting needs. Kerosene lamps were brighter, could be adjusted for light intensity, didn't need constant replacement like candles did, and were more economical for extended use. They had their own downsides. They were fire hazards, they smelled, they required regular cleaning, but they were better than candles for most purposes. Gas lighting was spreading in urban areas. Starting in the early 1800s, coal gas was piped to streetlights in major cities, and by mid-century, gas lighting was being installed in wealthier urban homes and businesses. Gaslight was steady, bright, and convenient. You just turned a valve instead of lighting individual candles or lamps. It was expensive to install, required access to gas lines, and wasn't practical for rural areas. But in cities, gas lighting was rapidly supplanting candles and oil lamps.
And then came electricity. Edison's successful demonstration of a practical incandescent bulb in 1879 was the beginning of the end for candles as a necessity. It would take decades for electrical lighting to spread widely, first to urban centers, then gradually to smaller towns, eventually reaching rural areas in the early to mid-20th century. But the trajectory was clear. Electric light was superior in almost every way, and once the infrastructure existed to support it, candles became obsolete. Candle manufacturers saw this coming. The smart ones diversified. Procter & Gamble, as mentioned, shifted focus to soap and other household products. Other companies tried to find niche markets: religious candles, decorative candles, emergency candles. Some went out of business. The industry contracted significantly between the 1890s and 1920s as electric lighting spread. By the 1920s in urban America and Western Europe, candles were already quaint anachronisms. They were what you used during power outages. They were ceremonial objects in churches. They were decorative centerpieces for fancy dinners. They were not how people lit their homes on a daily basis anymore. The Great Depression saw a brief uptick in candle use as people tried to save money on electricity costs, but this was temporary. By the mid-20th century, candles had fully transitioned from necessity to specialty product. The industry had to completely reinvent itself, focusing on aesthetics, scent, gifting, and creating reasons for people to buy products they didn't need. This is actually a fascinating business pivot when you think about it. For thousands of years, the candle industry existed to meet a fundamental human need, the need for light after dark. That need was universal and persistent. If you wanted to participate in evening activities, you needed candles or some equivalent light source. The market was essentially guaranteed. Then, within the span of maybe 50 years, that entire market disappeared. Electric light eliminated the fundamental need that candles had always served.
So the industry had to shift from selling necessity to selling luxury, from functional objects to decorative ones, from meeting a universal need to creating new wants. The success of this pivot is evident in the fact that there's still a multi-billion-dollar global candle industry today, even though nobody needs candles for lighting. Companies figured out that people would buy candles for ambiance, for scent, as gifts, as home decor, as part of self-care rituals, as Instagram props. They created entirely new markets and use cases that had nothing to do with the original function of candles. In some ways, this transition freed the candle industry to be more creative. When candles were primarily functional, there was pressure to keep costs low and production efficient. Form followed function. Candles were cylindrical because that's the most efficient shape to mold or dip. They were white or off-white because colored dyes were an unnecessary expense. They were unscented because fragrance added cost without improving the light output. But once candles became decorative objects, all those constraints fell away. Suddenly, you could make candles in any shape: spheres, cubes, elaborate molded figures. You could make them any color because aesthetics mattered more than cost. You could add scents because the scent was now a feature, not a bug. You could focus on creating products that looked good sitting on a shelf even when unlit, because that's how most decorative candles spend most of their existence. The modern candle sits in a weird space between art object, aromatherapy product, and vestigial technology. It's a fire source that we keep around not because we need fire, but because we find it aesthetically and psychologically pleasing. There's something fundamentally appealing about candlelight that has persisted despite superior lighting options being available. Maybe it's the evolutionary familiarity. Humans have been gathering around fires for hundreds of thousands of years, so firelight feels natural and comforting in a way that electric light doesn't. Maybe it's the dynamic quality. A candle flame moves and flickers, creating subtle shifting shadows, whereas electric light is static and uniform. Maybe it's nostalgia for a pre-electric past that none of us actually experienced, but that we've romanticized. Maybe it's just that candles smell nice and make spaces feel cozier. Whatever the reason, candles have persisted as consumer products well into the 21st century, long after their obsolescence as light sources. They've become purely optional, yet people keep buying them. We've taken an ancient technology and repurposed it as a luxury good, which is a very human thing to do. Let's talk about some specific historical moments in the decline of candles. The Electric Age, market reinvention, and modern candle culture. So, by 1900, the death knell was already sounding for candles as practical lighting. Electric lighting was expanding rapidly in American and European cities. The first central power station had opened in New York in 1882, and within 20 years, electric lighting was becoming standard in urban areas. By 1920, about 35% of American homes had electric service, and that number was climbing fast. The experience of transitioning from candle and gas light to electric light must have been genuinely transformative for people who lived through it. Imagine spending your entire life where evening meant either darkness or dim, flickering light from candles or lamps. Reading was difficult. Detailed work was nearly impossible. Evening activities were constrained by the limitations of artificial light. And then suddenly you have electric lights, bright, steady, safe, available at the flip of a switch. It would have seemed almost magical. Early electric lights had their own limitations, of course. The first incandescent bulbs were fragile, had relatively short lifespans, and the electrical infrastructure was unreliable. Power outages were common. Not every room in a house would be wired, often just one or two rooms initially, with people still using candles or lamps elsewhere. The cost of electricity was significant for working-class families. But even with these limitations, electric light was clearly the future. Rural electrification lagged significantly behind urban adoption. In the 1920s and 1930s, while American cities were largely electrified, most rural areas still lacked electrical service. Farms and small towns continued relying on candles, kerosene lamps, and later battery-powered flashlights well into the mid-20th century. The Rural Electrification Administration, established in 1935 as part of New Deal programs, worked to extend electrical service to rural areas, but this was a gradual process.
Some remote rural areas didn't get electrical service until the 1950s or even later. During this transition period, candles maintained a market presence but shifted in positioning. They were no longer everyday necessities but backup emergency supplies. Hardware stores sold candles alongside other emergency preparedness items. People kept candles on hand in case of power outages, which were still fairly common in the early electrical era. The two world wars had interesting effects on candle markets. World War I caused disruptions in paraffin supply and manufacturing capacity, and candles were rationed in some areas. World War II brought similar issues. Paraffin was a petroleum product, and petroleum was diverted to military use. In Europe particularly, where electrical infrastructure was damaged by bombing and combat, candles saw renewed use out of necessity. British civilians during the Blitz used candles extensively during blackouts when electric lights couldn't be used. People who had grown up after electric lighting became standard suddenly found themselves relying on candles the way their grandparents had. Post-war, in the 1950s and 1960s, the candle industry was at its lowest point in terms of practical utility. Electric lighting had become nearly universal in developed countries. Candles were genuinely optional for the first time in human history. The industry could have died completely, but instead, it reinvented itself. The shift to candles as decorative and gift items accelerated during this period. Manufacturers started producing candles in novel shapes: balls, columns, tapers in elegant holders, floating candles for pools and bowls. Colors became vibrant and varied. Scented candles, which had existed before but were niche products, became mainstream. The 1970s saw a boom in candle sales, partially driven by the whole crafty, back-to-nature, hippie-adjacent aesthetic of the era. People were into macrame, earth tones, and yes, candles. Big pillar candles in rust oranges and avocado greens. Hand-dipped tapers. Candle making became a popular hobby. You could buy kits with wax, wicks, dyes, and molds and make your own candles at home. This was marketed as both creative expression and economical, though the economic argument was questionable given that commercial candles were already cheap. Religious candles remained a steady market throughout this period. Catholic churches still used beeswax candles for Mass. Votive candles at shrines remained popular. Jewish households continued lighting Sabbath and memorial candles. The religious market was relatively price-insensitive and tradition-bound, which made it valuable for manufacturers to maintain. The scented candle market really exploded in the 1980s and 1990s. Companies figured out that they could charge premium prices for candles that smelled good. Yankee Candle, founded in 1969, grew from a small Massachusetts operation into a major national brand by focusing on high-quality scented candles. Their model was to offer a huge variety of scents, seasonal rotations, and upscale presentation. A Yankee Candle wasn't just a candle, it was an affordable luxury purchase. Bath & Body Works, a retail chain focused on personal care products, got into the candle business in the 1990s and became one of the largest candle retailers in the U.S. Their 3-wick candles became especially popular. They were marketed as having better scent throw than single-wick candles, and they retailed for around $20, which was expensive enough to feel special, but not so expensive that people couldn't justify impulse purchases. The container candle format became dominant during this period. Instead of freestanding candles that required a separate holder, container candles came in their own glass jars or tins. This was more convenient, no need to find an appropriate holder, no risk of wax dripping on furniture, and the containers themselves could be decorative. Once the candle was gone, you had a glass jar you could theoretically repurpose, though most people probably just threw them away.
Marketing became incredibly sophisticated. Companies conducted extensive research on what scents appealed to different demographics. They created complex scent profiles with names designed to evoke specific moods or memories. They packaged candles attractively and positioned them at checkout counters and end caps where they'd catch shoppers' eyes. They created gift sets, multiple candles packaged together, often with matching items like room sprays or lotions. They leveraged seasonal buying, pumpkin spice in fall, pine and cinnamon in winter, fresh florals in spring.
The rise of big box retailers and later e-commerce changed candle distribution. Instead of buying candles at specialty shops or craft stores, people could buy them at Target, Walmart, grocery stores, anywhere really. Online shopping made it possible to buy candles from small artisan producers anywhere in the country. The market fragmented between mass market brands sold everywhere and boutique brands sold through specialty retailers and online. Social media had an enormous impact on candle culture starting in the 2010s. Instagram and Pinterest became showcases for home decor aesthetics, and candles featured prominently. An artfully arranged candle in a nice holder with good lighting could rack up thousands of likes. Lifestyle influencers would show off their candle collections. Unboxing videos for expensive candles became a thing. The visual culture of social media elevated candles from mundane household objects to aesthetic signifiers. The wellness movement also boosted candle sales. Candles got positioned as self-care products. Lighting a candle became a ritual for relaxation, for creating a spa-like atmosphere at home, for practicing mindfulness. This was partly marketing, but partly genuine. Many people do find candlelight relaxing, and scent can affect mood. The aromatherapy industry marketed specific scents as having particular effects: lavender for relaxation, citrus for energy, eucalyptus for clarity. The scientific evidence for these claims is mixed at best, but the placebo effect is real, and if people feel better because they lit a lavender candle, that's a valid outcome. Luxury candle brands proliferated. Companies like Diptyque, Jo Malone, Le Labo, and Byredo sell candles for $50 to $80 or more, positioned as premium home fragrance products. These aren't fundamentally different from cheaper candles in terms of materials or performance, but the branding, packaging, and scent development are more sophisticated. The glass containers are heavier and more attractive. The scents are more complex and unusual. You're not getting generic vanilla, you're getting Vanille Absolute Mint, with notes of vanilla pod, tonka bean, and caramel. Whether this justifies the price premium is debatable, but people buy them, so clearly the market exists. The luxury candle market taps into the same psychology as luxury fashion or cosmetics. People want to signal taste and status, and a $70 candle sitting on your coffee table does that in a subtle way. It's aspirational consumption at a relatively accessible price point. You might not be able to afford a designer handbag, but you can afford a designer candle, and it gives you a little taste of that luxury lifestyle. Candle collecting became a genuine hobby for some people. Online communities formed around discussing candles, comparing scents, rating brands, sharing finds, warning about disappointing products. People would accumulate dozens or hundreds of candles, far more than they could realistically burn. The candles became decorative objects in their own right, valued more for having them than for using them. This is peak late capitalism, buying functional objects that you never use for their intended function because you enjoy owning them. The environmental and health consciousness movements created a market for clean candles. Concerns about paraffin being a petroleum product, about synthetic fragrances potentially being harmful, about wick materials and additives. All of this led to demand for candles made from soy, beeswax, or coconut wax, with cotton wicks and essential oil fragrances. Companies marketed these as natural, non-toxic, eco-friendly alternatives. Whether they're actually better is complicated. Natural doesn't automatically mean safe or environmentally superior, but the perception created a market segment. Male-targeted candles emerged as a niche in the 2010s. Traditional candle marketing had skewed heavily female, with scents and packaging that appealed to women. But companies realized there was an underserved market of men who might buy candles if they weren't so feminine-coded. Thus, mandals, scents like tobacco, leather, whiskey, cedar, and packaging in dark colors with masculine typography. The products themselves weren't meaningfully different, but the marketing succeeded in reaching customers who wouldn't have bought traditionally marketed candles. Novelty candles proliferated. Candles shaped like food, like body parts, like animals, like pop culture references. These were more about humor and gifting than actual use. People would buy a candle shaped like a slice of pizza or whatever as a gag gift or conversation piece. Some of these were cheaply made and burned terribly, but that wasn't really the point. They were decorative objects first, functional candles second or third. The hygge trend that swept through design culture in the mid-2015s, the Danish concept of cozy contentment, was excellent for candle sales.
Hygge aesthetics centered on creating warm, comfortable, candlelit spaces. Every article about Hygge mentioned candles extensively. Scandinavian design brands marketed candles as essential elements of Hygge living. Sales spiked as people tried to capture that cozy Danish vibe in their own homes. Candles became integrated into broader lifestyle branding. Hotels would have signature scents, a particular candle that burned in the lobby and was also sold in the gift shop, so guests could take that hotel experience home with them. Magazines would launch candle lines. Fashion brands would extend into home fragrances, including candles. The candle became a relatively low-stakes way for brands to extend into new product categories.
Subscription boxes for candles became a thing. Monthly deliveries of curated candles, supposedly selected based on your scent preferences, were marketed as convenient ways to discover new products. The economics of subscription models are favorable for sellers, predictable recurring revenue, and they capitalize on people's desire for novelty and discovery. Whether anyone actually needed a monthly candle subscription is questionable, but people signed up for them. The COVID-19 pandemic had unexpected effects on the candle market. With people spending more time at home, candle sales increased significantly. People were investing in making their homes more comfortable and pleasant. Candles were a relatively cheap way to improve your environment. There were also the viral stories about loss of smell being a COVID symptom, with people discovering they couldn't smell their candles anymore and realizing they might be infected. This created a weird moment where candles became a crude diagnostic tool. Post-pandemic, as people returned to offices and normal activities, candle sales remained elevated. The habits formed during lockdown persisted. The home had become more important as a space, and people maintained their investments in making it pleasant. The candle industry was not complaining about this sustained higher demand. The circular economy trend led to some interesting candle innovations. Companies started selling candle refills. You'd keep the container and buy just the wax refill, reducing waste. Recycling programs for used candle containers emerged. Some brands offered discounts if you returned your empty containers. This appealed to environmentally conscious consumers while also creating repeat purchase mechanisms. Smart candles, essentially LED lights designed to mimic candle flicker, carved out their own market. These were safer, lasted indefinitely, and could be used in places where real candles were prohibited or risky. They didn't have the scent aspect, obviously, and the light quality wasn't quite the same, but for certain applications, restaurants, hotels, outdoor events, they made sense. Real candle purists looked down on them, but they served a purpose. The candle industry today is remarkably robust for a product category that has been technically obsolete for over a century. Global candle sales are in the billions of dollars annually. The market continues growing, particularly in developing economies, where rising incomes mean more disposable spending on non-essential items like decorative candles. Manufacturing has largely moved to lower-cost countries. China produces a huge percentage of the world's candles, along with India, Thailand, and other Asian countries where labor costs are lower. Some premium brands, still manufactured domestically, made in the USA or made in France, can be selling points for luxury products, but mass-market candles are mostly imported. The technology of candle making hasn't changed fundamentally in decades. It's still wax, wick, and fragrance. Innovations are incremental: slightly better wax blends, more sophisticated scent development, improved wick technology, but there's no revolutionary new candle technology on the horizon because the basic design is already optimized for what it does. The future of candles seems secure, oddly enough. As long as humans find flickering firelight aesthetically pleasing and enjoy nice scents in their homes, there will be a market for candles. The product has successfully transitioned from necessity to luxury, from technology to art object, from utilitarian tool to lifestyle accessory. There's something poignant about this evolution. For thousands of years, candles represented humanity's struggle against darkness, our attempts to extend productive hours past sunset, to create light in a dark world. They were essential technology, as important as wheels or plows. And now they're decorative scented wax that we buy because the packaging is cute and it smells like autumn harvest or beach cottage or whatever fantasy we're trying to invoke. But maybe that's not a decline so much as a transformation. We've solved the problem of darkness. We have abundant, safe, reliable electric light available everywhere at negligible cost. So we've been freed to appreciate candles for their aesthetic and emotional qualities rather than their utilitarian function. We can enjoy candlelight as an experience rather than endure it as a necessity. The candle has outlived its purpose and persisted anyway, finding new reasons to exist. It's gone from critical technology to nostalgic luxury, from something people needed to something people want. And in a weird way, that might be the most successful evolution a technology can have, to become so beloved that people keep it around long after better alternatives exist, simply because they enjoy it.
Technical deep dives, global traditions, and final reflections. We're deep into this now, drifting through the technical minutiae and cultural oddities that make up the full history of candles. Let's sink into some specific technical aspects that we've touched on but haven't fully explored. Wick science is actually more complex than you'd think. The wick's job is to draw liquid wax up through capillary action and deliver it to the flame where it vaporizes and burns. The thickness, material, and construction of the wick all affect how the candle burns. Too thin a wick, and you get a weak flame that tunnels down the center, leaving wax on the sides. Too thick, and you get excessive heat, smoking, and rapid wax consumption. Modern wicks are usually braided cotton, sometimes with paper or other fibers mixed in for structural support. The braiding pattern matters. Tighter braids draw wax differently than looser ones. Some wicks are treated with chemical solutions that affect burn characteristics. Zinc core and cotton core wicks use metal or additional cotton to provide rigidity, which is important for larger diameter candles where a purely cotton wick would be too flexible. The self-trimming property we mentioned earlier comes from asymmetric braiding that causes the wick to curl as it burns, bringing the tip into the hottest part of the flame where it gets consumed. This prevents the buildup of carbon deposits that would otherwise make the flame smoke and sputter. It's a clever bit of engineering that seems simple, but took considerable experimentation to perfect. Wick sizing is specific to wax type and container diameter. A wick that works perfectly in a paraffin candle might be wrong for a soy candle of the same size, because soy melts at a lower temperature and has different viscosity. Candle manufacturers have extensive charts correlating wick sizes to container diameters and wax types. Getting this wrong results in poor burn performance, customer complaints, and returned products. The chemistry of candle burning is interesting if you're into combustion science. When a candle burns, the heat of the flame melts the wax, which is drawn up the wick. The liquid wax vaporizes in the heat and the vapor combusts in the flame. The flame itself has different zones, a relatively cool, dark area at the base where wax is vaporizing but not yet burning, a bright middle zone where most combustion occurs, and a dimmer outer zone where combustion completes. The blue color, sometimes visible at the base of a candle flame, indicates complete combustion with sufficient oxygen. The yellow-orange color of most candle flames comes from incandescent carbon particles, basically tiny bits of soot glowing hot. This is why candles produce some smoke even when burning cleanly. There's always some particulate matter from incomplete combustion. The amount of oxygen available affects burn quality significantly. A candle burning in a drafty area will flicker as air currents disrupt the flame. A candle burning in an enclosed space will eventually deplete oxygen and either go out or burn inefficiently with lots of smoke. This is why you shouldn't burn candles in truly sealed spaces. They consume oxygen and produce carbon dioxide and other combustion products. The wax type affects temperature and characteristics. Paraffin melts at around 37 to 65 degrees Celsius, depending on the specific formulation. Soy wax melts lower, around 49 to 52 degrees. Beeswax melts higher, around 62 to 65 degrees. These temperature differences affect how the candles burn, how the scent is released, and how the candles perform in different ambient temperatures. Harder waxes hold their shape better in warm conditions, but can be more difficult to get an even burn. Softer waxes melt more easily, which means better scent throw, but also more tendency to pool or deform. Commercial candle makers often blend different waxes to get desired characteristics. A bit of paraffin for hardness, some soy for clean burning, maybe a touch of palm wax for crystalline events. The additives in modern candles serve various purposes. Stearic acid is added to raise the melting point and make candles harder.
Vybar is a polymer additive that improves opacity and helps bind fragrance oils. UV inhibitors prevent colors from fading. Mold release agents help candles pop out of molds more easily. It's a whole chemistry set of ingredients beyond just wax, wick, and scent. Candle color chemistry is its own thing. The dyes need to be soluble in wax, stable at high temperatures, non-toxic, and produce the desired colors. Liquid dyes, dye chips, and powder dyes all have different properties. Some colors are easier to achieve than others. Blue can be tricky. Deep black requires a lot of dye. Pastels need careful measurement. The dye concentration affects not just color but also burn quality. Too much dye can clog wicks. Scent chemistry is even more complex. Fragrance oils for candles are formulated specifically for burning. They need to smell good both cold and when heated by the flame. The fragrance needs to be released steadily as the candle burns rather than all at once. The molecules need to be relatively stable at high temperatures so they don't break down into different smelling compounds. Top notes, middle notes, and base notes in fragrances affect how the scent evolves as the candle burns. Top notes are the most volatile and are what you smell first when you light the candle. Middle notes emerge as the candle burns and the wax pool forms. Base notes are the least volatile and persist throughout the burn. Well-designed fragrances have a balance of all three, so the scent stays interesting throughout the life of the candle. Some fragrance oils accelerate discoloration. Vanilla in particular tends to turn wax yellowish or brownish over time. This is why vanilla candles are already colored cream or brown rather than white. Other fragrances can affect the way wax sets, causing frosting, white crystalline patterns on the surface, or separation. Candle makers have to test extensively to ensure their fragrance and wax combinations work together. The concept of scent throw is important in the industry. Cold throw is how strong a candle smells when unlit. Hot throw is how well it scents a room when burning. Some candles have great cold throw but poor hot throw or vice versa. Achieving strong hot throw requires the right balance of fragrance concentration, wax type, and wick size to generate enough heat to vaporize the fragrance without burning too hot and destroying the scent molecules. Let's drift into some global candle traditions we haven't fully covered. In Japan, traditional candles were made from wax extracted from tree nuts and sumac berries. Japanese candles have a distinctive appearance. They're often hand-rolled with a hollow core and a tapered shape. The wax has a slight sheen and the candles burn with a particularly bright and steady flame. They're used in Buddhist temples and traditional ceremonies, and there are still artisan candle makers in Japan preserving these traditional techniques. In India, candles weren't historically common. Oil lamps were the traditional light source. But candle manufacturing became significant during the British colonial period, and India is now one of the world's major candle producers. Indian candles range from basic paraffin tapers for general use to elaborate decorative candles for weddings and festivals. Diwali in particular drives enormous candle sales, with people buying thousands of small candles to create the traditional displays of light.
In Mexico, candles have deep religious significance. Votive candles with images of saints are ubiquitous in Catholic homes and churches. People light these candles as part of prayers and devotions. The candle industry in Mexico produces millions of these religious candles annually. There's also a strong tradition of candles in Day of the Dead observances, where candles light the way for spirits returning to visit the living. The candles used are often specific colors: white for purity, purple for mourning, pink for celebration. African candle traditions vary enormously across the continent. In some regions, candles are relative modern introductions tied to European colonialism. In others, traditional oil lamps persisted until recent decades. Today, candles remain important in areas with unreliable electrical service. In South Africa, candle making has become a significant craft industry, with artisans creating colorful, geometric candles that are sold both locally and exported. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church uses beeswax candles extensively in religious ceremonies. The production of beeswax for candles is an important rural industry in parts of Ethiopia. The candles are often long, thin tapers that are held during processions and services. The smoke from the candles combines with incense to create the intensely aromatic atmosphere characteristic of Ethiopian Orthodox worship. In Scandinavia, beyond the hygge trend we mentioned, candles have practical importance during the long, dark winters. When you're looking at only a few hours of daylight during winter months, artificial light becomes psychologically important, even if you have electric lights. Scandinavian countries have among the highest per capita candle consumption in the world. It's not unusual for a Norwegian or Swedish household to burn through dozens of candles during winter months, just to create a sense of warmth and light during the darkness. The Russian Orthodox Church maintains traditional candle practices that mirror other Orthodox traditions. What's interesting is that during the Soviet period, when religious practice was discouraged or banned, people still found ways to maintain candle traditions. The persistence of these practices through 70 years of official atheism speaks to how deeply embedded they were in cultural and spiritual life. In the Philippines, a 9-day Christmas tradition called Simbang Gabi involves early morning masses where candles play a significant role. People carry candles in processions, and churches are decorated with elaborate candle arrangements. The tropical climate makes beeswax impractical, so most candles are paraffin, but the tradition itself is deeply meaningful to participants. Latin American quinceañera celebrations traditionally include a candle ceremony where the birthday girl lights candles representing different aspects of her life and important people. This has become an elaborate ritual with specific candles for parents, grandparents, friends, and various symbolic representations. The candles used are often decorative and coordinated with the party's color scheme. The use of candles in meditation practices spans multiple traditions. Buddhist meditation may involve gazing at a candle flame as a focus point. Some yoga practices incorporate candle gazing, tritaka, as both a meditation technique and an exercise for the eyes. New Age and neo-pagan practices often assign symbolic meanings to different colored candles for meditation and ritual purposes. Candles show up in secular traditions too. The Olympic flame, while not technically a candle, draws on similar symbolism, carrying light from one place to another, maintaining an unbroken flame. Memorial candles at vigils serve a similar purpose. The light represents the person being remembered, and the act of lighting candles collectively creates a sense of shared commemoration. The birthday cake tradition has evolved over time. Early versions involved a single candle. The practice of one candle per year of age became standard in the 20th century, though this becomes impractical for adults. Nobody wants to struggle to blow out 70 candles. The compromise of using number candles or just a few representative candles has become common. Trick candles that relight have become standard for certain ages, or as pranks, which is mildly annoying but has become an expected part of birthday culture. Let's talk about candle safety in more detail because it's genuinely important and often overlooked. The National Fire Protection Association estimates there are about 8,200 home fires started by candles annually in the United States, resulting in deaths, injuries, and over $250 million in property damage. Most of these are preventable with basic safety precautions. The leading cause of candle fires is leaving them unattended. People light a candle, leave the room, or fall asleep, and the candle continues burning. If it's near curtains, papers, or other flammable materials, a fire can start. The solution is simple but requires discipline. Never leave a burning candle unattended. If you leave the room, extinguish it. Before going to bed, make sure all candles are out. The second major cause is candles placed too close to flammable materials. That means keeping candles at least a foot away from anything that can burn. Curtains, books, papers, bedding, decorations. It also means being careful about what surface you place candles on. A candle burning down to the bottom of its container can get hot enough to crack glass or damage furniture surfaces. Children and pets are significant risk factors. A child knocking over a candle or trying to touch the flame can cause burns or fires. Pets, especially cats, can jump onto surfaces and knock over candles. If you have young children or pets, candles need to be placed well out of reach, or you should consider not burning them at all. Drafts are dangerous because they can blow lightweight materials like papers or curtains into the flame, or they can cause the flame to spread to the side of the container. Keep candles away from windows, fans, air vents, and high traffic areas where people passing by create air currents. The candle holder or container matters. Candles should be in stable, heat-resistant holders that won't tip over and won't be damaged by heat. Glass containers can crack if they get too hot, especially if there's a flaw in the glass or if cold water gets on hot glass. Metal holders get very hot and can cause burns if touched. Burning multiple candles close together is dangerous because the combined heat can be much greater than individual candles. Those decorative displays with dozens of tea lights or votives clustered together look pretty but generate significant cumulative heat. This can melt plastic, damage surfaces, crack glass, or ignite nearby materials. Trimming wicks to about 1/4 inch before lighting helps ensure an even burn and reduces smoking and mushrooming when carbon builds up on the wick tip. Using a wick trimmer or scissors designed for the purpose makes this easier. Long wicks lead to larger flames that burn too hot and can cause the issues we've described. Knowing how to properly extinguish a candle is important. Blowing them works, but can scatter hot wax and spark embers. Using a candle snuffer or just putting the lid on a candle container is safer. Some people use their fingers to pinch out the wick, which works but requires care to avoid burns. Never use water to extinguish a candle. This can cause hot wax to splatter and can crack glass containers. Some places have banned or restricted candles for safety reasons. College dormitories almost universally ban candles. Some apartment complexes prohibit them in leases. Hotels sometimes remove or disable candles in rooms. These restrictions exist because the fire risk in multi-unit buildings where many people live in close proximity is significant.
Despite all these risks, millions of people burn candles regularly without incident. The key is awareness and basic safety practices. Candles are no more inherently dangerous than any other source of open flame. Stovetops, gas fireplaces, outdoor fire pits all carry similar risks. With appropriate precautions, candles can be used safely. Let's meander into the environmental considerations of modern candles. The sustainability of candles is complicated and depends on what materials are used and how you measure impact. Paraffin, being a petroleum byproduct, has the environmental issues associated with fossil fuel extraction and refining. It's non-renewable, contributes to petroleum demand, and burning it releases carbon dioxide. However, paraffin represents a relatively small fraction of what gets extracted from crude oil. Most goes to fuels and plastics. The environmental impact of your candle collection is negligible compared to driving or flying or any other petroleum-consuming activity. Soy wax sounds more environmentally friendly as a plant-based, renewable resource. However, large-scale soybean cultivation has its own environmental issues: deforestation for farmland, monoculture farming practices, pesticide use, genetic modification concerns. Most soy wax comes from industrial soy operations, not some idyllic sustainable farm. Whether soy wax is actually better environmentally than paraffin depends on what factors you prioritize and how you account for agricultural impact. Palm wax comes from palm oil, which is notorious for driving rainforest destruction, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia. Palm plantations have replaced vast areas of rainforest, destroying habitat and contributing to climate change. Using palm wax candles is arguably worse environmentally than paraffin, despite being plant-based. Some companies use sustainably sourced palm wax certified by organizations like the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil, but enforcement and verification of these standards is inconsistent. Beeswax is probably the most environmentally sound option, assuming the bees are raised sustainably. Bees are important pollinators, so maintaining bee populations has broader ecological benefits. The wax is a natural byproduct of honey production. However, industrial-scale beekeeping has its own issues: monoculture crops for bees, use of antibiotics and pesticides, shipping bee colonies long distances for pollination services. Small-scale local beekeepers producing beeswax as a sideline to honey production is probably the most sustainable candle option, but also the most expensive and least available. Coconut wax is a newer entry that's marketed as sustainable. It's made from hydrogenated coconut oil, which comes from coconuts grown primarily in the Philippines and Indonesia. Coconut farming has less deforestation impact than palm oil and tends to be done on smaller scales, but it still has an environmental footprint. Coconut wax is expensive, which limits its market penetration. The fragrance oils in candles can contain synthetic compounds with their own manufacturing impacts. Natural essential oils are an alternative, but require vast quantities of plant material. It might take hundreds of pounds of lavender to produce a pound of essential oil, for instance. Whether synthetic or natural fragrances are better environmentally is debatable. The packaging of candles contributes significantly to environmental impact. Glass jars, metal tins, cardboard boxes, plastic wrapping, all of this requires resources to produce and energy to transport. Candles are often over-packaged for retail display purposes. A naked candle has less environmental impact than one in a heavy glass jar with cardboard box and plastic wrap, but consumer preferences drive packaging choices. Shipping candles globally adds carbon footprint. A candle manufactured in China, shipped to the US, and trucked to your local store has traveled thousands of miles. Buying locally made candles reduces this impact, but costs more and limits selection. The actual burning of candles releases carbon dioxide, water vapor, and small amounts of other combustion products into the air. The quantities are small. A candle might release 5 to 10 grams of CO2 per hour of burning, but they're not zero. Indoor air quality can be affected by burning many candles in enclosed spaces, with particulate matter and VOCs from fragrances accumulating. Realistically, if you're concerned about environmental impact, not burning candles at all is the most sustainable choice. They're entirely optional products that exist purely for enjoyment. But if you do buy candles, choosing beeswax or sustainably sourced soy, avoiding palm wax, minimizing packaging, buying locally made products, and not burning them excessively are ways to reduce impact. The candle industry isn't ignorant of environmental concerns. They respond to consumer preferences, and there's growing demand for eco-friendly options. But ultimately, candles are luxury products, and luxury tends to involve environmental cost. The question is whether the enjoyment derived justifies that cost, which each person has to answer for themselves. As we drift toward the conclusion of this extremely long journey through candle history, let's consider what candles represent in our modern world. They're nostalgia for a pre-electric past most of us never experienced. They're attempts to create ambiance in spaces dominated by screens and artificial light. They're small rituals of self-care and comfort. They're gifts that say, "I thought about you, but not too hard," because candles are easy gifts. They're decorative objects that happen to also be functional. Candles connect us to thousands of years of human history. When you light a candle, you're engaging with the same basic technology that ancient Egyptians used, that medieval monks read by, that colonial housewives made from animal fat. The form has changed, paraffin and cotton instead of tallow and rush, but the fundamental idea is unchanged. Fire on a wick, slowly consuming wax, providing light, and now scent. There's something almost defiant about candles persisting into the 21st century. They're obsolete technology that refuses to disappear. They're demonstrably inferior to electric lights for their original purpose, but have found new purposes that keep them relevant. They've evolved from necessity to choice, and in becoming choice, they've perhaps become more valued. We don't need candles, so each candle we buy and burn is an intentional decision to have fire and scent and flickering light in our lives. The democratization of candles over the last century is remarkable. For most of history, good candles, beeswax, spermaceti, were luxury goods available only to the wealthy and powerful. Common people made do with smelly tallow or dim rushlights. Now, anyone can afford candles that burn cleaner and better than what royalty had access to a few hundred years ago. A $10 candle from Target would be incomprehensibly luxurious to a medieval peasant. The sheer variety of modern candles would baffle our ancestors. Hundreds of scent options, dozens of shapes and sizes, every color imaginable, various wax formulations, all available at modest prices. The candle aisle at a store represents more choices than most historical people would encounter in their entire lives.
Whether this abundance is meaningful or overwhelming probably depends on your perspective.